planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head propagandized. Big chocolate points, flat outlines. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's a podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Yeah, it's showtime. All right. Yeah, folks, thanks for coming on in. Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Going to do a little bit of a different time today. We're on at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Don't usually do late afternoon podcast by George, but we had to move things around a little bit today so that we could accommodate our guest, who's a returnee, a regular on podcast by George. And I really like this guy. Let's bring his graphic up on screen here so that you can see. Stephen Semler, he's the co-founder of Security Policy Reform Institute. Stephen follows the money on U.S. foreign and domestic policy. He writes for working class grassroots organizers and candidates, but he says all are welcome, folks. Now, learn about the Security Policy Reform Institute at securityreform.org. You can follow him at Twitter at security_reform.org. And I'll be putting those web addresses and URLs up on the screen as we go along. And what are we going to be talking about? Well, we're going to be talking about what we talk about a lot on Podcast by George. It's the big three. It's climate, war, and healthcare. And we had Matthew Ho on last week. I hope you got to see that show. And we were talking about how healthcare in particular and war are intersecting as major issues as far as cost is concerned and the nation's attention. Today, we're going to be talking more about the climate and how it's being affected by the war machine. And a lot of people aren't even aware of the intersection. And Stephen's got this great ability through graphics and charts and stuff like that to put things in context, to contextualize, maybe is the word, how these things are working. So, and I've got some news of the day that I want to bring in here too, but let's go ahead and let's take that live line graphic off the screen and go ahead and bring Stephen in before I start the little rundown on the day's news. I kind of got some articles that I call "What in the Hell" that I want to get to. Hi, Stephen. How you doing, pal?
George, good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on here. I mean, I do these head snap kind of articles that come down the pike, and this first one I want to bring up here. I got to get this up big enough on the screen that I can read it. Now, January 6th is really riveting the nation's attention. I don't deal with it here a lot on the podcast. I'm really concerned as whether or not anything good is going to come of this. I'm afraid something bad is going to come out of it because it's going to send Donald Trump running back to the White House, maybe more so than ever, to get himself a pardon. And whether or not this is a show trial or whether or not anything will come from it, I don't know. And I've mentioned on the show before, Stephen, that because, people in this country are so addicted to the flat screen, and because they tend to get their understanding of the world, past, present, and future from Hollywood, that maybe this January 6th, what seems to be more like a show trial, may actually have some long-term effect. But this is out of the Associated Press. I'm just going to read through this real quickly because, again, this is kind of like in the what in the hell category. And while I'm reading this, I want people to think about my podcast here just yesterday with a team member for Jessica Resnicek. She is the water protector. She is the activist that stepped over the line and damaged a pipeline and set a couple of implements on fire up at DAPL. And she's been charged or sentenced under a domestic terrorism sentence, and she's doing 8 years in a prison in Minnesota for that. We had that on yesterday. Go back and check that out, folks, if you haven't had a chance to see it, because it is jaw-dropping. Okay, so think about that as I read through this. A Pennsylvania man pleaded guilty on Monday to attacking police officers and an Associated Press photographer during the January 6th, 2021 riot on the U.S. Capitol. In a deal with prosecutors, Alan Byerly, 55, admitted to wielding a stun gun while confronting officers who were trying to protect the Capitol from the angry mob. He also admitted to assaulting AP photographer John Minchelo, who was documenting the chaos and violence outside the building where lawmakers were meeting to certify President Joe Biden's election victory. In exchange for pleading guilty to 2 charges stemming from the attacks, prosecutors agreed to drop several other charges Byerly was facing, including civil disorder. An email seeking comment was sent to his attorneys after the hearing in Washington federal court. Now, authorities say another man, Benjamin Scott Burlew of Miami, Oklahoma, lunged toward the photographer and shoved him over the wall, causing Minchelo to land on his back. Burlew was arrested last August and scheduled to go on trial in October. A third man charged in the assault was arrested in May. Rodney Millstreet was this guy's name, is accused of grabbing Minchelo by his backpack and pulling him backward down the stairs and then shoving him. In a Facebook post a few days later, Millstreet said attacking the photographer was worth it, adding, "Hit him with everything God give." The crowd cheered. According to the court papers, I got to talk to this. I would like to get a hold of the AP photographer. Man, you don't have to be a pacifist when they're putting hands on you and they're attacking you. You can whoop their ass, and that's what this guy should have done. Now, authorities say shortly after assaulting Minchelo, Byerly approached police officers standing behind a row of bike racks who were trying to hold the pro-Trump mob, and Byerly approached the officers while holding up a stun gun and activated the weapon, but police were able to knock it out of his hand, prosecutors saying. I read that and I go, what in the hell? Okay, maybe it was in broad daylight and it was a riot and it was the circumstances and all this type of thing. But my God, just think if this was on a shadowy street an evening in some place in America and it was a black man and he had a stun gun in his hand. I mean, they would have shot the guy so full of holes you couldn't count the number of rounds that were fired, but somehow they were able to knock the stun gun out of this guy. And it could be that they didn't even have guns. Some of those bicycle cops didn't, so maybe that was it also. Now, Byerly continued to charge at the officers, striking and pushing them, and grabbed one officer's baton, authorities said. Officers were eventually able to restrain Byerly, but he got away with the help of another rider, according to charging documents. Byerly is among more than 300 people who have pleaded guilty so far to federal crimes stemming from the riot. More than 840 people have been charged with crimes ranging from low-level misdemeanors to serious felony charges, such as seditious conspiracy. Now, I don't know if any of them have been charged with domestic terrorism, which Jessica Resnicek was, but I read that and I think, my God, the things that people do, the breakdown in the rule of law and the things that people get away with and the light sentencing, because these fellows that I'm reading about in this article, they're going to get, if you read a little further into it, maybe a year, if that, maybe a little bit more than that. And on the heels of this coverage that I had on Jessica, I just had to cover that before we got to Stephen. So, Stephen, I know that you're following the hearings. Everybody is to a certain degree. I mean, I walk by the TV and see it more than anything. But what's your take on January 6th and these television hearings that we're having?
For the most part, I don't really follow them that much. But I think over time, I realized just how, I mean, I always knew it was very serious, but I think over time, especially with the Secret Service taking up their own set of private lawyers, I think this is runs a little bit deeper than any of us would have liked. And I hope, I mean, again, I don't mind the theatrics. I think it's kind of cheesy that they put it, they show the hearings in prime time. But if it spurs action regarding, basically, reaffirming people's right to vote, taking on white supremacy head on, then it's worth it. I fear, though, that Biden will not take action. Democrats will not take action in a productive way, though. So that's my only concern. But I mean, these people are hideous, and I think it's wise that you brought up the double standard when it comes to, you know, climate activism, which labeled as, and the only reason, you know, why that's terrorism charges and there's no terrorism charges for January 6th people is because there's not corporate backing to fighting. There's no, you know, Chevron or whoever's in charge of that pipeline.
She cost them a lot of money, boy. That's got $3.25 million, Stephen, she has to repay to the pipeline company. And so that was damage to property and big bucks. And that's what resulted an 8-year federal prison sentence.
Yeah, that's but what other options does she have as a climate activist?
But that was the point. Yeah.
You know?
She'd used and she'd done the protesting. She'd signed the petitions. She had carried placards. I mean, she had done all of those things.
She voted blue.
Yeah. I don't know if she voted blue or not, but yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, she had done everything that was permissible under the law to do, and it had no effect. The pipeline was going in, and that's what we talked about on that show. I want to encourage everybody to check that out, because that's when she stepped over the line, because those other things did not work, that Stephen is alluding to there. Well, okay. I wanted to, and I want to get to the main topic, but I wanted to bring this up because this reminded me of last time you were on, Stephen. You and I had discussed Uvalde, and now you're out east, and this probably hasn't hit your news out there, but I mean, this is big news in the heartland. I mean, this is a tragedy of the highest order. Look at this beautiful family here. They were in a park, and some nut with a gun killed him, except for the boy, the beautiful young son there with the orange glasses. But here's what we had talked about, and I said, when the media and law enforcement focuses on what door was left open and how long it took people to respond and that type of thing, it kind of intimates or makes people think that the police are the solution to this issue. Proper policing would solve and prevent these types of things. I ain't never going to do it, particularly where people are shooting at them. They're going to hide, and they're going to wait until the shooting's over with, and then they're going to go see if they can go arrest somebody. That's pretty much how this works. And the other angle on this is, and I've seen this as long as I've been covering police and fire stories, and I started back in the 80s in broadcast. It's always, they want to know the motive, Stephen. And I look at this and I'm like, what the hell? The guy was nuts. He had a gun. I mean, that was the motive. What kind of a legitimate motive does anyone think that there might be for this type of thing? And if you did know what was inside this nut's head, what difference would it make to you? And it reads like that right off the top. Now, this is reporting from Associated Press. The question at the center of an investigation of the killings of 3 family members, including a 6-year-old girl. There she is in her pink snow outfit there, in Eastern Iowa State Park campground, is why. That's what they want to know, why. The couple's 9-year-old son, Arlo, survived the attack without physical injury, but police have not said whether he was in the tent when the shootings happened. Now, what I do like about that sentence in the way that it's written, because it mentions physical injury. God, can you imagine the mental harm that's been done to that boy that survived? Mitch Modvet, assistant director of the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, said Monday that investigators have spoken to the boy, but so far, nothing is coming of that, understandably. But I guess my point on this story, and it's almost too tragic to even want to read, but the motive or the cause for this is the fact that we've got 400 million guns in this country. And what I say on my show all the time, Stephen, is not every gun owner is a nut, but every nut now has a gun. That's what the motive, that's what the cause, that's what the reason for this is. And to think that there's any other kind of motive, I think it just obfuscates what's happened here.
Yeah, I think you just about covered it. It's it's obviously a tough story to read, and I don't know.
It's America, man, and it ain't changing. That's the tragic part about it. We don't seem to have any initiative or move, and we're going to talk about this a little bit. We don't have the money, folks, quote, and I'm honest to God, to do something about the mentally ill people, these homicidal people that are in our society. So we can't do anything about that. And the guns have been around since guns have been around. I mean, I tell people, I know folks that have got guns from the Civil War era, for God's sake. They're not going anyplace. And you're not collecting them. They're not going to volunteer to give them up. The reason that they got them in many instances is to prevent folks from taking them. I mean, that's always going to be with us. And I think that is maybe the final irony, tragedy of these stories. I don't know how this is going to end, and it certainly isn't going to end in my lifetime. Okay, well, thanks for playing along here with us on these articles, Stephen. It's kind of like my What in the Hell segment that I like to start with, but I wanted to get to what you just authored in your Substack, and I want to encourage everybody to go to Substack and get Stephen Semler's articles on there. And I wanted to open with this, actually, because I thought this was great with Jimmy Dwork, and it shows us what's going on here. I know Stephen follows him, too. He says, Democratic politicians make suckers and chumps out of the people who vote for them on a daily basis. Your party is 100% corrupt and complicit in every evil we are experiencing right now. Democrat voters are enormously gullible and easy to scare into doing the business of oligarchs and empire. And I got to say, when I read that, he ain't a Republican, folks. This guy is not a Trump supporter, Jimmy Dore. But what he's bringing out here, what he's retweeting is Stephen's tweet, where he says the House just passed a bill, this was a couple of weeks ago, authorizing $840 billion for the Pentagon. Now, here's the thing, and this is what caused me to do maybe a double head snap. More Republicans voted against it than Democrats. I went, oh, holy buckets. Wow, that's where we're at. I mean, more Republicans are voting against defense spending, against weapons of war, against the war machine, warmongering than the Democrats. I had this tweet of yours up when I talked to Matthew Ho, and the point that I made, Stephen, is that the Republicans probably aren't doing this for altruistic humankind, soft and fuzzy reasons. They're probably doing it for some financial, budgetary reasons, or, why would it be this way? Why are explain it to us.
So a lot of different theories at play, but one that I heard that I know is wrong is that one person suggested that more Democrats would vote for it than Republicans because it's Biden's military budget. That's like suggesting that there's a partisan dimension at play here. Maybe you'd have to go around and ask them, but on a larger scale, that explanation doesn't hold up, because during the Obama administration compared to the Trump administration, Democrats voted more often for Trump's military budgets than Obama's military budgets. So there's not exactly that partisan dimension that I think people suspected or maybe hoped for. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, the overall theme, the overall trajectory of what Biden's on is that I think he gave up on his Build Back Better agenda, before December of last year. And I think he's really sold out and now gone for the, basically a Republican or a Democratic version of Reagan, where it's about deficit reduction, which Reagan was purportedly about, but didn't really, and massive increases in military spending, and kind of cultivating war as his ultimate, not only domestic project, but project for American unity. And that has replaced the domestic spending on climate, health, etc., that he campaigned on.
And this is a trend line that has steadily been going up forever. I mean, for decades. The other thing that would not be correct would be to think, well, the Democrats all voted for this one time because of Ukraine. That's also definitely not the circumstance.
No, people say, this money's necessary for Ukraine, and all the Republicans voted against it are just, Putin fans, which is dumb for a bunch of reasons. But the two main ones are, most of the Ukrainian aid comes through supplemental bills. This was the main military budget. There's supplemental pockets supplemental legislation used to fund the Ukraine aid response. That's outside of this budget. And the second reason is the Russian war in Ukraine isn't reason to increase the military budget. The story of the invasion, or one of them, has been Russia's failure to progress quickly, or at least as quickly as anticipated. I suspected going in that Russia would, if they decided to invade to the extent that they are, that they would basically roll through the Ukrainian countryside and into the metropoles, maybe face some stiff, holdouts in various urban centers, but overall have an easy time. That's been not the case. It's kind of been pathetic. And I worry that just to take a brief sidetrack here, I worry that the U.S.'s fixation on degrading Russia's conventional military abilities only leaves them with nuclear options, which pushes them closer. So I don't really, again, taking a step back and just saying, look, a massive increase in military spending isn't going to solve the military problem in Ukraine. It could make it worse. But it's, Republican and Democratic votes on this wouldn't be logically tied to their position on the Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine, because again, funding comes from a different bill. And also the way they pursue strategy, the preferred strategy for the conflict in Ukraine would be determined by other acts than this defense budget.
And the funding that you mentioned, also the funding for these two major political parties, including the Democrats, and a lot of Democrats that you would not suspect, come from these military contractors, from the military industrial complex. And they've been voting for this stuff right along. And they'll excuse it by saying that they've got factories and bomb builders in their districts, as an example. But it's just people need to follow the money here. Like Stephen does, to understand that this is a bipartisan issue. This National Defense Authorization Act looks to me like it's going to go over $1 trillion pretty soon. And as a great Lee Camp said on my show, $1 trillion is a stack of $1,000 bills 67 miles high. And when you take the under the table funding with this above table funding in the national, it probably is right at $1 trillion. Okay, so let me bring this up on screen here, because we're going to get to this article here in USA Today, and then get into Stephen's Substack, because this is kind of the framework of what we're speaking of. President Joe Biden announced executive actions Wednesday to address climate change after his legislative agenda faced a setback. He needs the backing of all 50 Democratic senators, but Senator Joe Manchin, the evil one, the Democrat from West Virginia, rejected a domestic policy package designed to combat climate change and raise taxes. And so here comes Stephen in Outrider, and this is his article. Biden's militarized foreign policy is obstructing his climate agenda. Climate change isn't budgeted as the existential threat Biden said it was. Yeah, it's as we talked about on the last time you're on, Stephen, it's increased dramatically. There's a, what is it? Is it 40-some billion dollars or something like that? But it's not nearly on scale what needs to be done, correct?
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah. Now, when Biden values more according to his own metrics, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value is weapons production. Okay, so here it goes. Now, the budget request Joe Biden submitted to Congress in late March calls for more than $813 billion in military spending for fiscal year 2023. Now, they added to that, right? It's actually more than that. Is that correct?
Yeah, the House added $37 billion. So when you see that $840 billion figure, that's the amount that's under the House Armed Services Committee's jurisdiction. There's about $11 billion out there that's outside the committee's jurisdiction, but is part of the military budget. So whether you say 840 or 850 is right, it just depends on what you're talking about. So the House did add $37 billion on top of that 813. So now we're at 850 billion for fiscal year 2023. But that 813 is what Biden requested, which was itself, let's do the math here, about 40 billion, or like 37 billion more than was enacted for fiscal year 2022. So the House's increase was an increase on top of an increase.
And they just threw it at him. He didn't even ask for it. They put that on top of it. And that doesn't include these emergency stipends for Ukraine, right? This is something separate.
That's correct. I've been meening to actually tally the total expenditures when it comes to this base budget plus this supplemental funding for Ukraine, in other words. But I think I'm kind of afraid to look at it. But I am curious enough to get past that initial part of resistance. So I'll keep you updated.
Well, and I look back on like the Captain Butt Crunch, as I call him, Donald Trump, and you think of him as a warmonger, although he didn't really start any new wars, he exacerbated wars. But look at this. I mean, they're putting more money on the table for war making than they did with Donald Trump, and it just keeps trending upward. Stephen writes that save for the stretch of Pentagon spending from 2007 to 2011 that funded U.S. troop surges in Iraq and Afghanistan, Biden's proposed military budget is larger than any enacted military budget since World War II. Think about that, folks. I mean, think about what we've been through since World War II. This is more money that we're spending on this. And again, I got to emphasize, in public view, on top of the table than any time since World War II, Stephen.
That's right. Higher than Korea, higher than Vietnam, higher than higher than any Cold War high. And that includes Reagan's legendary buildup in the early 80s. So, yeah, we're if you look at that peak from 2007 to 2011, that was back-to-back troop surges, as the article says, and first in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. We don't have nearly as many troops abroad as we did then. So why is the military budget higher?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, excellent point. Okay. So let's go to the next slide here. While military spending consumes more than half of the $1.6 trillion budget request. Now think about that. God, more than half of everything in the budget. And it's 1.6 trillion overall. Biden allocates less than 3% of the proposed funding for tackling the climate crisis. And this is where we're going to get at this contextualization that you're so good at that I talked about, because I didn't think of it in these terms until I started to look at this. And I think this is really important, folks. A similar funding disparity derailed Biden's climate plan in fiscal year 2022. Now, despite a historic climate investment, the considerably larger investment in the Pentagon all but guaranteed that military-related emissions would easily offset any expected reductions from the new climate programs. Now, I hadn't heard anybody speak of it in these terms until you did, Stephen. I didn't think of it this way. I was kind of happy in some respects that money had been earmarked to address the climate catastrophe, because to me, that's the top of the funnel. That's the thing that's going to get us all probably within 20 years or so if we don't address it. And I thought, well, it ain't nearly enough. It's a pittance, but my God, at least they have started the process. But in fact, with this military budget increase, we've actually gone backwards in some respects. Lay that out for us.
Right. So during the now dead Build Back Better negotiations, the goal of that legislation was to enact a federal spending regimen that would meet Biden's stated climate goal, which was reduce emissions roughly by half. So throughout the negotiations and their back and forth with Manchin and other conservative Democrats that we don't hear about as much, as they were taking things out, they were sort of adding different things in. It's like, okay, we could remove this funding, but we could regulate, we could add this regulation in, or this new authority in, that would still get us to that emissions target despite a lower amount of funding. And I just found that whole thing really interesting, because it's essentially like budgeting, like, projecting how much will be spent each year, like into the future, but it's done with the climate as the currency. So I thought it was just really cool. And, again, this was like the genesis of this article comparing these three things was to basically say, talk is cheap, but I do so in a way where I borrow from not only an in-depth look at federal budgets, but also climate modeling to just compare Biden's spending priorities and the real effects that has. Because he says, like, this is a historic climate investment. It's like, well, yeah, your infrastructure bill does make a climate investment. However, it's about controlling the controllables. So if your military budget produces, 5 times more than what the infrastructure reduces in terms of carbon emissions, then we're going the wrong direction and you're not actually helping anything.
It reminds me of the old magician's trick. I mean, it's kind of like, let me see if I can get this on screen. Here's my left hand. Don't watch what my right's doing over here. Look at my left hand. Yeah, look, we've got record spending to try to do something to mitigate the climate. Look at this. Yeah, That's really good. But we're going to increase the military emissions and pollution so much that this is completely irrelevant. All right, we're going to lose Stephen here. He's only got another 10, 15 minutes with us. So we got to get through these things. So this was from his newsletter. And again, I want to encourage everybody to go and sign up for that. This is a Speaking Security newsletter. The House just passed its version of the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, the annual bill responsible for setting a whole bunch of military policies, most notably the top line figure for the budget that we talked about. That's now at $840.2 billion. The White House hasn't settled on a coherent, consistent explanation for inflation yet, but when Biden has been in the mood to blame federal spending, he's invoked the stimulus checks. I mean, I apologize for laughing, but my God, we're talking about a $1,400 check that Americans got, the American Rescue Plan. Prices have gone up because people have more money now because of the first major piece of legislation I passed, Biden said in a speech to November, calling it an irony. I got to tell you something, folks, there ain't anybody that's got any of that $1,400 left. If they did, they couldn't find it, couldn't account for it. It's not affecting inflation. I mean, that is absolutely crazy. We're talking about $840 billion annually, renewable, increasing according to the trend line that we talked about. And we're blaming inflation on a one-time $1,400 stimulus check that Biden gave Americans when he first came into office. I mean, that's not funny, haha. That's kind of funny, tragic, or funny, weird, Stephen.
Yeah, the same reaction. I'm kind of giggling to myself, like, oh man, I would hate to know. I had to take a dive into my subconscious and try to figure out what emotion this really is that I'm masking with laughing. So, yeah, I mean, look, at the first sniff of inflation, Biden blamed federal spending, and then he threw the $1,400 checks under the bus. Why? Yeah. Federal spending could be part of the solution for inflation. So as long as you're, unblocking supply chains, you're making things more efficient, you're using the federal government's buying power to negotiate lower prices for, let's say, prescription drugs. And, aside, I mean, the COVID pandemic was massive. Is massive globally. There's still lockdowns in some places, and there's still labor shortages because people are sick or dead or don't want to, risk working there. So there are natural cost increases. I don't know why he jumped so quickly to blaming federal spending. But now it's sort of like, oh, now we know, because he doesn't really care about his domestic agenda. He just wants to be seen as sort of a heroic, romanticized wartime president.
And he's apparently not reading or paying any attention to economists, because there's tons of the most highly regarded and recognized economists that will tell you that putting money in the hands of Americans actually stimulates the economy, doesn't increase inflation like he's talking about it, particularly 2 years later. The kind of federal spending that we're talking about with the military and all that, that's all counterproductive. I mean, that could have an inflationary impact in this volume of money that's washed through the system every year, not to mention the climate. So let me... I want to show this chart that you put together, because you're really good with these things. The fiscal year 2023 Pentagon budget costs well over twice as much as Biden's stimulus checks. And this gets to what I was talking about. This is the 2023 budget, a one-year budget that costs twice as much as Biden's stimulus checks. And there it is. I mean, you can look at it right there.
Yeah, I'm kind of realizing a mistake I made. I should have, because the $1,400 checks were enacted for fiscal year 21. I should have added military spending for fiscal year 21, fiscal year 22, and that. So, but I mean, it still gets the point home, because Biden will support this military budget. He didn't raise a stink about the inflationary impact of the House just dumping another $37 billion on top of his own budget request increase. So it's just peculiar. I subscribe that, if you tally all that military spending in the aggregate, or even for that 1 year, its inflationary impact is probably more than whatever those checks did. And, if you're going to pick on federal spending, it's like you're really going to single out the one thing that actually helped people, these $1,400 checks. The one thing, one of the major reasons why people went to the polls is because you guaranteed $2,000 checks. You immediately pissed a whole bunch of people off by giving them only $1,400.
I know it.
And then you could basically seal the fate of providing any additional recompense by shitting on your, under-delivered, excuse my language, under-delivered
That's right.
a $1,400 check. So it's one of these things, George, where, it's obvious, like at this point, to a bunch of people, but it still hasn't entered public consciousness yet. And Biden could have made inroads as president to highlight this disparity.
Yeah, and he didn't, and he
kind
won't.
Yeah, and it would have been so productive to counter Republican attacks on Biden's social spending regime, but instead Biden just lets them off the hook by basically calling out government spending as the culprit, but not military spending. That's different.
Yeah, and like we talked about on the last show, I can't understand the guy. I can't figure out what he's doing. Again, we're picking on Democrats a lot of the time, but it's because I tell people that the Republicans ran down to the right side of the political platform down at the train station. They went off the right side a decade ago. They're gone. That train's gone off the tracks. I mean, that crazy train has left, folks. If there's any help on the horizon, if there's any hope, it's got to come from these Democrats. I mean, they've got to step up. They've got to do something. All right. So again, I wanted to get through these charts because I really like these things. The progress Biden's infrastructure bill makes on climate is effectively canceled out several times over by the pollution enabled by the outsized military budget. So talk us through this one, Stephen.
This is a calculation of yearly emissions from the military-industrial complex for a Brown University study, the Cost of War project. They're amazing. So they calculated that between the U.S. military's operations, their bases, and the accompanying industry that supports, armament production and, sustaining this global empire and network of bases, you get around 340 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. So basically greenhouse gases. Next, I juxtapose it next to what this project, the climate modeling project at Princeton University, I think it's called the Zero Project, that did all sorts of modeling on Biden's various climate proposals. And this is what they had for the expected emissions impact of Biden's infrastructure bill as passed by 2030. So this chart actually undersells how badly it races, because the infrastructure bill, its projects take a while to kick into effect and takes a while to reach this eventual standard, while every single year we're going to get at least, this is a conservative estimate, by the way, 340 million metric tons of military emissions. So if I had plotted it out over, say, a 10-year stretch, this chart would have been a lot more damning, but also a lot more confusing. So that's why I elected to just go with the annual snapshot here.
All right, great. Before we leave and lose Stephen here, I want to bring this up. This is a comment up from Mary Knox. Now, she's a friend of the podcast by George. I want to encourage people to go to Facebook, follow Mary Knox. She's great. And she's going to introduce this next segment. She didn't know it when she left this comment, but this reads right into our next slide. Our U.S. military is also our biggest polluter in the world and the biggest fossil fuel user in the United States. And you put a chart together that shows it in relation to other countries, just the U.S. military in relation to other countries. And here we are. I took the comment down. You can see us here. Again, this is pretty small type, but we're right up there. The military, that is as opposed to other countries that polluting the planet, Stephen.
Yeah, she's right. This number that you see here on this chart, that's a combination of military industry plus the military itself. What she's talking about is the U.S. military as an individual institution, and it's correctly labeled as the largest institutional consumer of petroleum and producer of greenhouse gases in the world. And even by itself, it's haunting. Even if you put the military itself on this chart, it would be further down. But adding in the military industrial complex as a whole, you get, basically a subsection of the U.S. economy with 4 million people in it, polluting more than Egypt, a country with over 100 million people in it.
Yeah.
So it's just it's such a pity because, you know, the U.S., you know, U.S. military budgets, obviously, like its yearly budget exceeds most countries' GDP. And think about, like, it's as much as like Switzerland's GDP. Think about, like, if you were president and you had, you know, control, wouldn't you be pushing for, you know, like, okay, we have this is military budget. I mean, this is something like we have an entire country's GDP here. What if we put it all towards climate?
Yeah.
That would be amazing. That's the only thing really that keeps me going.
That's what we need to do. Yeah.
We're so close, George. We really are. I know it seems insurmountable at times, but think about the difference between taking on Amazon, for example, which everyone uses, has you know, huge reach. It would take a massive organizing effort to bring that down, which is why the ongoing union efforts by, you know, Christian Smalls and others are so impressive. But with this military budget, we know who the buyers are. It's members of Congress. There's only a few hundred of them. So I know that you know, this is just, it's almost too, you know, big to look at the military budgets. It's like the sun. But if you can refocus on, you know, okay, this is an evil thing, but there's a lot of cool stuff happening in it. One of the things is, you know, for contractors, Biden, after the $15 minimum wage thing failed, or Democrats gave up basically on it, Biden signed an executive order making a $15 an hour wage minimum for all federal contractors. Furthermore, he can invoke labor laws, expand them to contractors where federal contracts could only be given to unionized workforces, effectively putting the government on the union side for once. So a lot of the things that we wish to see in the, you know, free market, quote unquote, we see in the military industrial complex. And these are things that we need for the climate movement, because climate workers, unless you're a STEM scientist, if you're like a solar panel installer, for example, you're non-union, you're below minimum wage, and your work sucks and it's hard.
And no lifelong benefits. Yeah.
Out in the damn sun. So there's a lot of promise here that we could just convert this thing to something else. But I mean, the war machine doesn't mess around, obviously. So it's going to take a lot of effort, but I hope what we discussed today will be useful to some people.
Well, and that's a good close. I mean, and I love the optimism and I love the hope, because we got to have it, folks. And the time is nigh. You know, one of my jobs as host is to be able to, you know, carry the conversation, hopefully ask some questions, but also got to keep track of the time. And Steven's out of time. He told me, he said he had 40 minutes when we started, and we're over time now. I've got the securityreform.org up on the screen. Where else can people follow you? Where else can they subscribe to the Substack? Give us that as our closer, Steven, and we'll get you on your way.
Just search for my name, Steven Semler, on Substack, and you'll find my newsletter, and search my name on Twitter, and it's the same handle, @Steven Semler. So, George, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, viewers, for yours, and looking forward to taking down the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, we got to, just like he said. Folks, he's on his way. He's out of here. Steven, as always, thanks for coming on Podcast by George. We'll talk again soon, and we never have enough time. He is an excellent guest. Go to Steven Semler on Twitter. That's a great place to follow him. That's what I do. And folks, if you like Podcast by George, if you like guests like him, and if you like what we bring to the table on this show, I need subscribers. I need followers. It's all free. Doesn't cost a thing. Just go to podcastbygeorge.com. Sign up. I mean, pick a platform. You can watch the videos like this. The live lines are on Facebook and YouTube. You can subscribe on YouTube, ring the notification bell, give us a thumbs up. You can follow us on Facebook. That's easy to do. And then if you like the audio versions, if you like listening to those while you're biking or commuting or whatever the case might be, there's a lot of places to get those, including Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, of course, iTunes, and it's really easy. Just click that button and sign up, and you are in. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is today, folks, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.